Hello, everyone out there, and welcome to today's ODI Fridays. So welcome to everyone outside, welcome to everybody in the room as well. So we're here today to hear from Mor and Tim about the book, The State of Open Data, which they've been working on over the last year, along with over 60 authors and over 200 collaborators, including several of the ODI team. So they're going to be running us through that book, and we'll be taking questions at the end. For those who are watching outside the room, you can use the hashtag ODI Fridays. We'll be watching that for questions. You can also tag in at State of Open Data, or use the hashtag State of Open Data, because Mor and Tim have been doing a lot, and their other co-authors and have been doing a lot of talks around the world around this book, and it will help join up those conversations. But for now, if we could ask the people in the room, just be aware, we're live mic, there's people watching at home, so if you do want to ask questions or make comments, ask for a microphone, and then people may be able to hear you. We hope those will work, particularly if you hold it correctly, which I often fail to do. So just be aware of that audience at home, are all part of the experience. But for now, I'll pass over to Mor and Tim.
Hello, everybody. Let's just get people around. So yes, my name is Mor. I'm one of the co-authors. This is The State of Open Data. This is also The State of Open Data. Lovely book, 574 pages. You can get it online. But I will present to you a bit about what this is, why we have done it, and how. So, State of Open Data, you can look at it at stateofopendata.od4d.net. It's a beautiful website. If you want to save the world from paper, go there and have a look. It's a project and it's a book and it's all in open access, just as we like to do in the open spaces. And we started it because we wanted to know what happened in the past of open data to understand what can we actually see and understand and make recommendation for the future. Sounds really easy. Also sounds a bit weird because open data is only 10, 12 years old. So what can we look? But Tim will discuss about it in a second. So do go there and check out I think it's a beautiful site, but I'm biased. So who's behind it? So we work with the IDRC, International Development Research Center Canada, that are basically the initiator behind the OD4D, the Open Data for Development, and it's a global partnership that creates an ecosystem to understand open data and other issues like government transparency and how it all creates to the global sustainable development. OD4D has hubs all over the world, going from Latin America to Sub-Saharan Africa to MENA, and received a lot of support through the years for the funders here. And there's a lot of research coming from OD4D that you should look at, but this book is part of that initiative. So these are some of our authors on this book. This book has 66 authors from 5 continents and 24 countries. Third of them are from the Global South. We try to make it as inclusive as we can and as diverse as we can. But we found that it's really tricky still to try to get people from the Global South to contribute to the book for many reasons. We're very open about all of the process that we've done. So if you're going to our blog on Medium, you can see how we actually wrote about it and reflect about it and how you can do an open research that is inclusive for everyone. So I'll just explain what we try to do as well. Great. So while creating this book, this research, we try to do a methodology that is open and collaborative. So we started that each of our authors got basically a questionnaire to fill with trying to understand this environment that they're looking at. So it looked at the history, at issues, at actors, at funding, at events, etc. Then we took this scan, we called it an environment scan, and we put it online on a Google Doc, and basically open it up to the world to see how many contributions we'll get. And we got hundreds of them, which was very, very good for us and very encouraging. So these communities' inputs are still live. So if you go to our website, you can see the environment scan and how all of this chapter began. And you can also try and get the data out of it. And you can still actually comment on it if you want as well. But it's there live. If other people want to build their research on top of it, you can. So it's there. Then we took this all community input, we gave it to our authors to create a chapter from it. Then we had the review mechanism with our review board, which was actually 50-50 male-female compared to our authors. And we took it to another review, and we made this report that you see here. It's not a bulletproof methodology, but I think it's trying to also see how, if we're speaking about communities and sectors, we can get them into the research and into the work that we're doing actively, and not only giving them, us as a community, something at the end. And we hope that this is still not the end, meaning that you will discuss this book, that you criticize this book and the chapters, because I don't know how many of you read the whole book, but like, we do want this to be some kind of also a conversation and not only something that you read and forget about. So hopefully this ways of doing this methodology, but also coming and speaking to you today and to others, will help us do that. So we're very grateful for the ODI for giving us the space to do that. So yeah, so now I'll pass the mic to Tim, or I'll just move around because he has a mic and you can speak.
So my challenge now was framed the project, how we pulled together a review of 10 years of open data. My challenge is now in 10 or 15 minutes to give you an overview of what's in the 580 pages here. So I'll try and do my best. Luckily, we have a couple of the authors who've contributed chapters here, and I'll be getting them to share a bit deeper dive into their chapters as well as we go. So in the book, we have 5 different lenses that we use to look at the state of open data. We say, what's happened in this last decade? And the first lens is a historical lens. And for each chapter online, you'll find there's a timeline looking at key events that have happened. But we also take a timeline throughout the whole history of this last decade. And one of the recommendations we make at the end of the book for researchers particularly is that we need to document the history of open data. We need to tell the story of what's happened, because when we came to look at different sectors where open data is being used, different projects, we found a web of broken links and abandoned websites and things that have gone offline, and we found not as strong as there should be historical understanding of where we've come from and where we're heading. And having that perspective is really important to strengthen advocacy, engagement and activity in future. So what we do in the opening to the book is we look at the evolution of open data through the themes at the International Open Data Conference. There have now been 5 editions of that conference, and as you look at their agendas, as you look at what's discussed, you see a real evolution of a movement. In 2010, it was all about portals and data sets. People wanting to get their data.gov online, publish as many data sets, the UK and US competing over who can count the most data sets published. It was very much focused on that supply side. Very quickly, by 2012, the second conference that happened in Washington, the focus was on impact. People were saying, we're not just doing this to get data out there, we want to achieve real-world impacts with this data. By 2015, that had focused into a sectoral turn, a recognition that you can't talk about impact in general. You've got to talk about what is open data doing for health, what's open data doing for agriculture, what's open data doing in education. And we saw a real flowering of different communities of practice looking at open data in their specific areas of work. By 2016, when the conference was in Madrid, the focus was on setting global goals, but looking at where impact can be had locally. So we have things like the International Open Data Charter that grew out of the G8 Open Data Charter that sets global principles, but that also involves a recognition that where this really happens is the city level, the local level, the community level where impact is secured. And by 2018, some real critical arguments though coming in, some new themes. Open data no longer the only data debate in the policy arena. Lots of talk about artificial intelligence, about big data, lots of discussions of data infrastructure starting to emerge, but also a sense that maybe open data is also under threat. That was the first time the conference had sessions that were saying, is this whole agenda under threat? And so that history gives us a sense of a movement that's really matured and developed, but also that has to find its way into the future. And when we started pulling together those first submissions of chapters into the book, we had this feeling that there was a bit of an identity crisis, open data facing, as we put it, maybe coming up to its difficult teenage years, working out what its identity is and is going to be. So we see that it's something that has moved from the margins to the mainstream. 10 years ago, it was small groups of geeks talking about open data. Now it's there in international policy statements. You know, it's a phrase and framing that prime ministers and presidents will still use, trips off the tongue, is part of major policy debates. But as it moves from that margins to the mainstream, we get a question of, do we have one open data movement, or do we now have many different movements? Those sectoral movements, how linked up are they? Is what's going on in agriculture connecting with what's happening in anti-corruption or in education or in environmental spaces? And we've also got this challenge of confronting the dark side of data. In the last 5 years, we've become much, much more aware that while data can be a force for good, it can also be abused, misused, used to control. And that's something that wasn't there in those early narratives of open data. And we've not always found a brilliant way to integrate and understand. And so one of these identity challenges for open data is the move not to just say open by default and only open by default, but to get to that greater nuance. There was also a real trend that came out across those early chapter drafts of the people who were the outside agitators and activists are now hired into the World Bank, hired into city governments, hired into national governments, are driving things from the inside. And that creates a real shift in the character of a community and a movement from something that's maybe insurgent to now institutionalizing. And that needs a moment of reflection to think about what that means for movement building, community building, knowledge sharing. And there was also this sense of, is open last decade's debate, or is it a golden thread that needs to run through all of the data policy agendas we've got? Now, as a spoiler, we very much conclude that it is a golden thread that needs to run through wider data policy agendas, but that does need work to articulate what that is and renew leadership on open data. And really that's what came out as we looked at this sense of an identity crisis. As we peeled away deeper and worked on the revisions of chapters with people, we saw actually there's many, many stories of impact. There's many stories of progress. And in fact, what seemed to be at work was Amara's famous adage about technology, that we overestimate progress in the short term and underestimate progress in the long term. And actually, over that decade of 10 years, so much has been shifted and so much has progressed, but that's been trickier to see when perhaps we got beyond the hype cycle and found that the reality of building data infrastructures is a longer term project than some of the early sales pitches presented. So we find that need to redefine and re-emphasize the importance of open approaches, particularly in our current political landscape, and to recognize that in the evolution of an open data movement today, we can't rely on the idea that everyone involved comes from the same open source or open government cultures. These many movements have many roots now. After a decade, many of the early leaders have moved on. And so it's important that we're collectively creating the space for supporting and championing new leaders who are keeping openness at the heart of our data vocabulary. And before I move on to look at the different sections of the book, on that I want to just pick up on a particular insight from Davies and colleagues when they write about North America, Australia and New Zealand that backs up the importance of retaining a focus on open data even as the data agenda broadens and shifts. In their chapter, they ask us to consider the counterfactual of what would have happened in the last decade if we'd not had the open data movement around, if we'd not had governments first thinking about the value of data through open data. They say otherwise we'd have big data analytics teams all being outsourced instead of governments building that capacity in-house because they understand the value of data. We'd have even more black boxes where open data has given government a tool when it engages with all these new data agendas to ask critical questions about what's happening. It's something that our authors of the Eastern Europe and Central Asia chapter put as open data has allowed people to hone their technical intuition in ways that they're applying beyond open data itself across the whole of government technology. And so we see this history, this evolution of an open data movement. We see the spread globally of open data. In the book, we've got chapters on 7 different regions, looking at the way that history is played out. I'm not going to go through in detail what's happened in each region because that would take me many, many hours. And I'd encourage you to really dig into those chapters, particularly from regions you don't often think about or work on, because I think there's inspiration there and learning to see our own work through a different lens. But I do want to highlight something that really came out as we read across them, which is that whilst open data has spread globally, it's framed and sustained in quite different ways around the world right now. The narratives and the language being used vary substantially, and we have to think about what that means, both for the way we then talk about open data practice, but also what it means for the way projects might evolve. And does this mean same product, different packaging? Or does this mean in some cases the product is being changed to fit different markets, different settings? So in Middle East and North Africa, you won't hear open data mentioned much. You'll hear much more a language of data-driven innovation. And you'll see the partners are more likely to be universities and private sector than civil society organisations. Whereas in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, it is the accountability and anti-corruption NGOs who've been the real drivers of open data work, those newer CSOs who've emerged, who've taken on this kind of agenda. In the European Union, the public sector information narrative is still strong and still a lever that can be used to pursue kind of policy change. Whereas in Africa, sustainable development language is much more the framing within which open data work's taking place, and that also highlights the role of national statistical offices as real drivers of the agenda there. In Asia, our authors look at the fact that it's much more national level activity right now, but they call for a move to the local level. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, there's a real different character to the community that civil society is really well networked in a way that maybe existed in Europe 5 years ago, but Europe's perhaps lost some of its strong civil society networking and needs to learn from how Latin America has sustained that. And lastly, in North America, Australia and New Zealand, the focus very much on government analytics, on building teams who can use data inside government, but those teams then using open data and proprietary data interchangeably, highlighting that need for a continued kind of agenda and focus on openness. So we look across all those regions. Then in the largest sector of the book, and I'm not expecting anyone to read this off the slide, we look at 16 different sectors where open data is used. And it was a really hard job to pick which sectors to focus on. There are many more since we've been kind of writing that we wish we dug into. And that's been really encouraging to see all the different settings in which open data is being used, all the ways in which people are adapting it and using it to meet particular policy challenges. So encouragingly, in each of these chapters, you will find some real diverse examples of data in use, but you'll also find diagnosis of areas where further development is needed. So, for example, in the transport chapter, the authors note the real success of standards like GTFS for opening up transit data, but they note that a lot of transit data isn't openly licensed. And a lot of times, the data you get in your mobile app turns out not to be available as open data. It's been provided through a deal between the transit company and Google or someone else. And so the rosy picture maybe isn't as shiny as it needs to be, and we need to keep an eye very closely that the progress made early in open data is maintained, and also that we continue pushing forward. So they argue until we have open fare data as well as timetable data, we're not going to get to mobility as a service in the ways that might be possible, or at least we're not going to get to that in a distributed open marketplace without monopoly providers taking that space. In the chapter I contributed on land ownership, we also note that where land ownership data is available, it is being used by citizens, by civil society, by entrepreneurs, and by journalists to explore what's happening with land ownership, to highlight corruption, to change markets. And we also note that a lot of progress has been made on responsible data practices in the land space, real sensitive use of licensing terms to recognise the balance between publicity and transparency and privacy, and to recognise the power dynamics that exist around land, recognising you can't talk about data in general, you have to understand data in relation to the particular realities it relates to. If it's data about land, then when access to land is unequal, opening up data has to recognise that and be sensitive to the political and economic dynamics. However, we also find there's no global initiative on land data transparency. So if we compare to sectors like aid transparency or extractives or anti-corruption work on open contracting, we see powerful initiatives that have really pushed the agenda forwards on opening up data. And we see other sectors like land where there's a real potential for that to happen, but no initiative doing it. And that calls for some deeper research into how these relatively low-cost initiatives can have a substantial impact on shifting the norm sector by sector about what is or isn't open. In a very similar way in telecommunications, an area we'd expect, it's digital, it's data rich, surely we'd have a lot of open data about the telecom sector, yet we don't right now. And there's the startings of an initiative that chapter explores to say, let's open up telecoms data, particularly in the developing world, in order to really get the change in connectivity, access, equity of access that we need. And as I've said there, it's important to note that a lot of the substantive progress on open data is not coming from organisations setting up data portals or publishing ad hoc data sets. It's coming from these sectoral initiatives that are adopting open data as a method to deliver better coordination, greater transparency, or some other form of change. So projects like Open Active that are here hosted here at the ODI, or Open Ownership seeking to open up corporate information, these are the sorts of projects that are really driving forward open data activity around the world, because they have a problem, they have a data infrastructure they've identified, they have policy, they have technology, and they put those things together to drive forward change. And so by taking the sectoral lens, looking at different sectors where open data is used, we're also able to look at how open data is embedded within these wider fields. Is it at the heart of the agriculture world, or is it just a small community on the side of agriculture? Is it there shaping government finance discussions, or just showing some prototypes around the edge? And that's an approach we also take in the education chapter, which is my segue to saying we're also really glad to have with us Javier and Leo, who put together the education chapter, and I'm going to get them to give you 3 or 4 minutes overview of what they found.
I think this is working now. Yeah, lovely to be here. So exciting to be part of this fantastic project. I thought we could open our little cameo appearance just by talking about how we came really into kind of working in this space. And we're both working in education and specifically researching open education topics for quite a few years, and really in the open education space, what we've seen is a sort of maturing of the open education movement. So that it's sort of begun with a lot of fanfare, a lot of kind of utopian visions around how simply making stuff available and putting an open license on it is going to kind of massively transform the world. And as time has gone on, more kind of critical questions have surfaced, and there's been a lot more discussion of like how these things are more difficult than we think, and does everybody have the opportunity to participate, and is everyone's does everybody want access to the same open resources and things like that. And so we were also we were interested in that, but also in the fact that we have these parallel open movements that seem to talk in kind of somewhat siloed conversations, and so we were also quite interested in thinking about what if we could get these movements more in conversation with each other. What could we learn from each other, and are we seeing similar, I guess, moves towards criticality around what we're trying to do across these different open movements? And so it was with the Open Education Working Group, which is a sort of a subgroup of Open Knowledge, that we saw a few years ago. There was a bit of work around open data in education happening, and so we kind of brought our initial idea there, which was to call for people to give us case studies of work that they were doing with open data in education, and that led to editing a collection of really interesting case studies, and then further research, and ultimately to these key findings of our chapter, which Javier, you're going to talk about now.
Oh, yeah, thanks. So what we were thinking when we start writing this chapter is to divide the three key or main areas in which open data affects education directly or indirectly. So the first is how open data can inform better educational policies. Normally, education policies are made without educators around. That's quite normal in our field, mostly for like primary and secondary education. Educators or teachers are never involved in policy making, but they should be one of the main providers of data. So if data in education is transparent, may foster better policies. The other one was where we said, okay, we need to also look at the data in education with a bit of care. And there are too many ethical concerns about how children are being datafied, how education is being datafied, and children are not taught to challenge, they don't know how to challenge their own datification. So it's a bit of like, okay, they say producing data about school results, for example, or performance might lead to better educational choices, but that's not true. It only works for the people that can have a choice, and it stigmatizes children. So we wanted to talk about the issues if you don't manage data with care. Children are the first one to be affected, but they can never challenge that data. And finally, it's like we've been working with Leo for a few years, and people were first we started looking at us like, well, you're too crazy. Now they're fine with us. How to use open data in educational context as open educational resources. So if you look at the definition of, or the traditional definitions of open educational resources, data is never included. So we think if you bring in data to the classroom from primary to university, that might develop the skills that people need to challenge the reality and the politics. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so this chapter, like many, really explores how within that wider field, open data is finding niches, making connections, but there's more stronger connections to be made. And I think this comes out also the health chapter, for example, reminds us that open data conferences, we can get 1,000 people along to things now. A standard health conference, you're going to find 20, 30,000 people there. How are we connecting open data ideas into those other fields? Have we got communities that are talking inwards or are talking outwards? And how can we give communities who've found ways to use data effectively, who've built that mature understanding of how to use this sensitively as a tool of change, how can we now support those groups to go out back to their kind of home communities and build capacity there? And that brings me to some of these cross-cutting issues that we then look at in a section called Issues in Open Data, where we see the real growing sophistication of the open data field. For example, a number of issues that were not on the agenda a few years ago, like gender equity and indigenous data sovereignty, that are increasingly in focus and that call for us to keep reevaluating some of the early assumptions that were made in open data practice. For example, in the Indigenous Open Data Sovereignty chapter, the authors offer a new challenge to the idea of open by default, where an open by default approach assumes that nation-state governments have the right to open up data about indigenous territories without the consent of those populations. This reminds us that the real world is often much, much more complex than our simple datafied narratives assume, and that the designers of data sets and of data policies really need to understand the environments that their data is describing and to consider the power dynamics and the different interests that their decisions affect. It moves us from just saying, let's get some raw data and open it up, to recognizing the power of that data to describe and shape the world brings with it a great responsibility to make sure that is designed in inclusive ways. Similarly, in the gender equity chapter, the authors really highlight how gender impacts issues of access and infrastructure, representation within data sets, and labour and leadership within the open data communities as a whole. And they call for a commitment to gender equity that addresses both gender bias within data collection and publication, as well as the gender bias and patterns of exclusion that mean women are often not in the room when decisions about data are being discussed, and challenge us to really say we can no longer accept data that's not considering inclusion and considering its inclusive impacts as good data. In this section, there's also a real focus on the growing importance of data infrastructure, a chapter from Peter and Lee here at the ODI. And the work on privacy in this section also really highlights how tools like the data spectrum, also created here at the ODI, have helped the open data field move towards a much more nuanced understanding of how to manage privacy, recognising that we need to strike a balance on a case-by-case basis, again, understanding the politics and the dynamics of particular data sets. So, for example, corporate ownership data, recognising there's a trade-off between the publicity of directors' information and the privacy that people deserve, and recognising that this isn't a kind of general principle that can be applied once, but is something that has to be played out depending on the subject of the data. And in the algorithms and AI chapter in here, I make the argument that there's been relatively limited engagement, surprisingly limited engagement, I think, between AI and open data communities over the last few years. And the way that open data is mostly presented in artificial intelligence policy is in a sort of circa 2010 raw material for AI industries kind of framing. Yet open data can also be seen as a strategic tool for evaluating bias in AI and addressing gaps in source data to try and remove that bias, as well as a distributed alternative to the centralizing logic of many machine learning approaches, which rely on centralized black box decision making, where open data has this alternative narrative of distributing power to people and communities to understand their own reality, to critique that data, create things with it, and make decisions at a more localized level. And there's a whole space there, I think, still to be unpacked and explored of not just open data as an input for this kind of growing world of algorithmic decision making, but open data as an alternative as well, and a check and a balance on that. And in that vein, we argue that AI literacy is best taught as part of open data literacy, equipping people to solve problems with data rather than teaching people to have a particular kind of algorithmic hammer that sees everything as a nail. Which brings me to the data literacy chapter, which I particularly want to highlight, because in many, many chapters, particularly the sectoral chapters, data literacy comes up as an absolutely critical theme. It comes up in education, like how do we use open data as an open educational resource to build people's data literacy. In many settings, authors diagnose that the lack of focus on data literacy means we've not capitalized enough on the improvements in data supply. And so in that chapter, Mariel Garcia Montes and Dirk Slater argue that we need to really redouble our efforts to focus on data literacy building, to recognize that data is a team sport. It's something that's not about one individual person having the unicorn data skills, but about having people with the mix of skills to be data architects, data engineers, data social scientists, data visualizers, people with questions, people with skills to answer. And they argue for a real focus on social learning and on learning that's focused on social justice. And in that chapter, they find that while there have been some small investments in training and capacity building, when you actually try and add it up, it really is a drop in the ocean. I think we didn't manage to count more than 20 or 30,000 people going across evaluations of different kind of recognized data literacy programs. It's the tens of thousands of people we can count having been trained in open data literacy, rather than the hundreds of thousands and millions that are needed to get the benefit from those millions of data sets that have been opened up. So I think that's something we put in the recommendations to funders particularly, to say we really need to focus on this much, much more. And that brings me to the last section of the book I want to focus on, which is our stakeholder section. where we look at how different stakeholders are playing a role. One of those obviously being funders and investors. This map comes from those environment scans Mor mentioned, where the chapter authors here, Fernando Perini and Michael Jarvis, took all those scans and looked at who are people mentioning as funders of different activities, who are the kind of central funders bringing communities together, who are the people out on the edges maybe looking at a particular niche geography or niche area. And it was quite encouraging to see the number of different players and actors in the space supporting open data work, either as open data or simply because it's a tool to solve problems those funders care about. And we look at a number of different stakeholders. We look at how governments are trying to strike this careful balance between institutionalizing open data and building their own governance frameworks, whilst avoiding the creation of new gatekeeping roles and stifling the collaboration and creative space that open data opened up. And that's something we really have to kind of watch in the coming years, that we want good governance of data, but good governance of data within government frameworks can sometimes mean new hurdles, new barriers, new gatekeeping. So helping government through that journey, I think, is key. And for civil society, Chris Wilson has a wonderful chapter which kind of talks about civil society's dogged optimism around open data's potential and its very flexible role filling the gaps that others maybe haven't filled, but that also creating confusion at times of what's a startup, what's civil society, and also highlighting the need for us to build the capacity of existing civil society, not just start-up tech civil society, to work with data, so that it's the established organisations with mass memberships, with movements, with a base who understand social care or who understand health or understand service delivery at the local level, so that they too are getting data capacity, the ability to use open data, not relying just on a number of small kind of internationally focused organisations. And of course, with government, civil society, we also look at the private sector, which is my segue to our other author segment, which is to hand to Carla to come and share with us some of the findings from the private sector chapter.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. I'm Carla Bonina. I'm an assistant professor at Surrey Business School and also at the Latin America Initiative of Open Data. First, congratulations again, because this has been an amazing effort. I do encourage you to go through many of the chapters that I think many of you are interested in very different areas. So very briefly, what I would like to share with you of this chapter, we're here, sorry about that. As Tim mentioned, and I think this is also part of the power of this book, we have a history or the sort of, timeline that would highlight some of the points. And I think this is a very good example on how the private sector really, exploded. When two things happened. 2012, McKinsey, the consultancy, estimated that the economic benefits of open data were about, between $3 and $5 trillion. So people were like, there is business here. And then in 2013, the Climate Corporation, have you heard about this company? Probably they were using open data plus other sources of data to create, a very good company to predict weather and other things that Monsanto acquired for over $1 billion. So this, we could say, was the first unicorn, in the open data world. So basically, what we're trying to tap in this chapter, that I encourage you to go, and there are many more points, are four main things, and that we can summarize in these key points. There was always this thing: is there a thing or a sector of open data as a business? And we find that both businesses are either users, intermediaries, or producers of open data, and rarely will define themselves as an open data enterprise as a sector per se. Basically, thousands of companies are using open data for their own business intelligence, marketing decisions, improving or opening markets, and so on. We do have what we call the open data intermediaries that we see, and this is very home, to what the ODI is doing, companies that started their own business as, packaging open data, selling new services based on that, and that's what we call the intermediaries, and others that are simply open up open data and producing them. We also call that data collaboratives, and you can see many more examples in the chapter. We also have the incubators and accelerators have supported many of these companies or especially startups to flourish, being the ODI very good examples. As you know, we highlighted in other parts, this is not very much the case, I would say very rarely in the global south, but we do have very good accelerators and incubators, especially in Europe, in North America. There's been this promise that open data is going to make, small. I'm just jumping here, sorry. It's going to be a great resource for the small and medium enterprises. Well, we still don't see that really happening, especially because on the one hand, you have the advantage that you don't have to deal with lots of legacy systems and so on, but then data literacy and other sorts of resources are really lacking. So we still have much more to do in that space. Definitely large and I mean all sort of business using open data for operations and new products and services, and also definitely a greater space for innovation. And something that also links to the measurement problem is that we'll still don't know how much economic impact this is really creating, and we mostly have perspective or sort of post-hoc analysis of some of the measurements, but this is very much intertwined with many other things happening. So really grasping how much exactly open data is creating an economic value is still uncertain. And with that note, I will encourage you to look at many more details that we have in that chapter, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Carla. So, each of the chapters has that sort of depth to it, and I hope you can find them useful, both giving conceptual tools, data, references to follow up, and resources to use in thinking about your practice and future practice. What I want to close with, though, and bring Mor back to join me for this, is some of the recommendations we put in the end of the book. So we called it Histories and Horizons, and in looking to those horizons, we come up with 4 kind of groups of recommendations, which are targeted at different stakeholder groups: researchers, funders, policymakers, and practitioners.
Cool. So I'll start with the 2 at the top. So researchers, first of all, we need to document history. One of the main findings of writing this book is that Wayback Machine is our best friend. Even though we are all technologists, we're speaking about data infrastructure and how to save data, we still had a lot of dead links that we had to go and check and to find. So we need to do better in document our history so we can do more projects like these and understand from them, but also just not putting it in a graveyard. We need to start to compare between open and non-open. Most of the research that looks out there looks at what open does, and we're not usually looking at what is open or semi-open. That ODI start to do some work on this, but we need more in academia as well to check what are the benefits, where stuff works, when not, when we can learn from one another. This is not a competition. And we also need to have more quantitative evidence and natural experiments. We're speaking about this book. This is very qualitative, but we do need to have more quantitative ways of looking at open data, understand it, measure it even sometimes when needed, and understand how we can use different research methods in part of our research. Then if we're working for funders, who are really important, like everyone else, we need to basically see how we're mainstreaming and creating a movement building. So it's really important to invest in core open data and infrastructure, but not everyone always understands what it means. It's not the most sexiest thing that you want to sell or you can sell. So how we explain it better, not making it sexy, but making it important so people can actually invest in the infrastructure that we need, because there is a market failure and the market is not going to invest in it. How we can integrate open data approaches into sectoral programs. So how can we basically say that if we have an agriculture program, there is an open data element to it? Or how we can say that if we're having an anti-corruption program, we have a data literacy into it, so we can actually integrate it. So it's not only looking at core funding, but how we can integrate open data and others to create better impact. And then we need to focus funding on open data literacy. If we want more people to use, if we want actually something to happen with open data, we need to teach people data literacy, but also what is open data means and how they can use it.
And the policymaker recommendations mirror that in many ways. The idea really here is after 10 years, some people are saying we should move on. We've done the open data thing. Let's kind of now focus on just embedding this purely in sectoral programming. We don't need to focus on open data anymore. And we find that's not the case. We still need to keep building core skills, experience, knowledge around openness and renewing that leadership. But at the same time, we need to embed this, because that's not going to be the answer 10 years from now again, that we need to keep on about the open thing. It's going to be this needs to become part of business as usual, embedded in practice in specific programs. So the starting point for that as a policymaker is look at the potential open data elements in any data-related project. And that doesn't mean now just publishing a data set. That might mean saying, we are looking at health systems, we're looking at what should be open. So that's not the health records themselves, that's the metadata about system performance that can be accountable and open. So it's finding the right level to put openness within a program. This idea of maintaining some of the space for permissionless innovation and civic engagement. As we institutionalize, as we recognize we need to talk to our data users, we need to find those people, invite them in for a meeting, we need to make sure those meetings don't become closed door chats between a few small stakeholders, but maintain the kind of openness that led us to get the generative space that's been so useful so far, and to have open data and openness as a golden thread across our data policy. And then for practitioners, the recommendations really focus on thinking politically and increasing inclusion. We can't approach any of these open data problems as technical alone anymore, and we hope the book is a real resource to see how different people have thought politically in different sectors, have understood the wider context they're working in, how people have prioritized inclusion and equity, and how we are providing that renewed leadership for openness into the next decade. So that's it. I think time for questions.
A lot.
Thank you very much. So we're open for questions now. So again, for people watching at home, at work, in the park, wherever you may be, if you tweet us in, either tagging in ODIH. Again. It is now. So, for people who have got questions, if you could tweet at them who are watching at home or not in the office, if you could please tweet them in, either tag in ODIHQ or use the hashtag ODI Fridays. Then we'll be able to pick those up and ask them. But also want to actually I think I'll start off with one question for myself, and then we'll go to the room here as well. I saw there's one hand already. But so one question for myself. So I spent this morning at a conference on competition policy, where I was taking the principles of openness and data and applying those to problems in competition policy. And in there, I find I need to I talk about combining open approaches, but using open and shared data to deliver on some of the competition challenges, like with big platforms and things like that. I was wondering if those themes about the combining of the different parts of the spectrum, what you learned about that during the production of the book.
So I think it does come up in a number of settings, particularly, say, the health chapter, where that's really in clear view, that we have data that's clearly private, data that can be open, and negotiating what's in that shared space in the middle then becomes where the real work is to be done. So I think some sectors are picking up on that and really recognising it. I think there is this interesting challenge that sometimes that language creates that space for the new gatekeeping, which is why we need to find ways in open data communities to constructively engage with that, to be the watchdogs pulling it towards open where it can be, but also recognising that space of shared. I think what we do find in the book very clearly is people have got a much more nuanced understanding now than a simple kind of binary, and it was fascinating. Things like the open definition and licensing really didn't come up that much less than I thought they would, of people kind of saying here's a strict binary line.
We're less purist than what we used to be in the beginning, but we still need to basically understand the terms and speak to them. But we're less purist. It's not a bad thing.
It's all about solving the problem.
Yeah.
Thank you both. So first questions in the room. If you could speak into the microphone, just for the people at home.
Thank you. I'm Ville Aula from London School of Economics, and I got really interested in the part that you were saying that there's more diversity in the kinds of people who are engaged in open data nowadays, and the people who initially were there are also going on. And when you were then in the end talking about the politics and engagement, how do you see that these are overlapping, that there's more diversity in who's in there, and there's also more need to have like a practically engaged idea of how we're going to address the political implications of the open data?
You want me? So when we're speaking about inclusion and diversity, and even if we're going into a gender equity chapter that actually just look at binary gender, we still have a lot of work to do. So when we're looking at it basically in the last 5 years, when we're speaking about indigenous community, we also see it in the last 5 years. So yes, we're getting a bit more inclusive, but not, or diverse, but not as diverse as we would like to see. And there's a lot more work that starts to be done either in the IODC spaces that we have in the International Open Data Conference. We saw it in the Open Government Partnership Summit last week, but there's still a lot of work to do. It's on one hand, it's basically making sure that the data we collect does look, for example, a gender, which is something that sounds very like basic, but does not happen. And on the other hand is how we actually, when we're fostering leaders, when we're thinking about thought leadership, we're thinking also about women and non-binary people and not only about men. As we said, like most of the people in the beginning were men from the global north. So speaking about that, how we also enforce people from the global, not enforce, but like get more people from the global south and more hearing. And I think the regional chapter shows really amazing point of view that are coming from the global south, the people from the global north not necessarily knows. So I think more reading about that and engaging in conversation between north to south can also help to create that.
And I think that there's two other elements there. One is the sectoral turn, I think, has really helped that diversity, because you recognise you don't need just a data specialist, you need an anti-corruption specialist, you need those people to come together. And so I think what we've got is sectors where and it's interesting to explore those spaces where it's been data-led, where someone's come and said, look, I think data can help here, but I need to find the specialist on the domain, or where it's come from the domain itself, where practitioners have said, look, we've started to identify there's a data problem here, let's get the technical specialists in. And I think lots more teams are created that way now than just having someone who says, look, we've got to do something cool with a data set and let's get started. I think linked to that, though, there's been a very conscious effort to do that. So people like IDRC through the Open Data for Development Network really investing in bringing people to conferences, getting people networked. And I think that links again to this kind of continued movement building needed, is that didn't happen organically, that needed support, that needed investment to say, the agriculture specialist who's not sure if this is a thing, they need some support to come along to the first thing and explore it and work out that this is something that they can get their head around. And I think another part of that is finding the ways of having a conversation that doesn't go over people's heads by being all about data formats and technologies, but is much more about the stories of change.
It's constant conscious effort of trying to get more people on board.
So any more questions in the room? Could speak into the microphone.
I'm curious about both the subject of the dark implications of open data and the AI side. So there are shifts in machine learning so that there are methodologies to allow data to remain on the edge on people's devices, for example, which means that there will be learning without accessing data. Are there any implications in your research of this new implications of what this might mean for the open data as a whole?
So the simple answer is no, there's nothing that came up in this particular piece of research, but because we didn't dig deeply into that. I guess the quick gut reaction would be we should look at what's happened over the last 10 years and learn from it around where theoretical decentralization is there, but in practice what works as a business model is the thing that centralizes. And so we need to really look at the economics of that as well as the what's technically possible.
I had a question around if a team is doing benchmarking on SDG basis, and if they want to make use of the existing open data to create the correlation with their research and create a cross-cutting so that they can understand the bigger picture. So what would be the best way for them to start looking into?
Very good question.
The national statistics chapter?
Yeah,
Yes.
probably, yeah.
Yes. So there is a chapter about national statistic in the book under communities and sectors, and it also shows the shift that national statistic have done in order to basically use open data, also mainly to monitor the sustainable development goals. There are some data sets that do exist to help to do that. There's some data sets that do not exist at all. And that's a beginning of a conversation. Looking at the UN Data Forum, for example, last year, starting to speak about open data. It's already like a big shift. How you can find those data sets, though, in all the countries, that's a different question. As we said, like Portal used to have all this data. Now they have a lot less of them. So
I guess the one other place it comes up in the book is in the land ownership chapter. Yeah. There's a mention there of work that Land Portal have been doing to map the availability of data to meet SDG indicators. Because one of the interesting challenges, as you probably know, with so many indicators is the flows of data to actually measure them aren't necessarily there yet. And I guess that the other link there is that SDGs have called on us to build new data infrastructures in order to be able to monitor and measure. And thinking about how all those can be open is an important piece of the picture.
Okay, I suppose, so I'm just looking at the feed on social media, and there's a particularly amusing exchange about data's identity crisis going on in one part of the Twitter sphere.
where are we?
Whether the data itself can have an identity crisis, or is it the people, etc. But I suppose just when I'm actually looking at that thread, so one of the things in there is when the open data movement started, and it was quite purist, it was focused a lot on corruption issues, strengthening democracy, empowering citizens, and that did start in the global north. And in those highly developed countries now, a lot more of the attention is now on how do we make money? How do we grow our economies from this? So the tension between these two, how do we make sure we don't lose track of some of those still vital issues about strengthening democracy and fighting corruption?
So I don't want my every answer to be the sectoral turn, but I think that's what really comes out is when you look at open data in general. Yeah, we saw many different sales pitches. So I'd argue we've always had these different movements there, wanting it for economic development, wanting it for democratization, from a pure transparency kind of normative point of view. All those arguments were there, and over those first kind of 3-4 years of open data spreading globally, people picked the argument that would work for the audience they were talking to. So you see, as global financial crisis hit, our arguments became economic. I don't think it was that suddenly we discovered the economic value. I think it was much more about the politics around. There is that big question of, does the narrative we use change what we do? And at the high level, yes, maybe it does in terms of what government policy is. When we get to those sectoral focused areas, the anti-corruption practitioners are using open data as a tool of anti-corruption. The private sector are using it in particular ways. But Carla's probably got something to add to that on private sector.
I'd like to add something quickly. When I first discovered that, for example, Montevideo was first to open, to publish their open data records, even before, the global north, I was actually very surprised in a good way. I don't think this needs to be a trade-off, and I'm speaking from my experience in Latin America, where we do need much more, digging into sustainable business models, and actually that open data contributing to economic benefits is equally important because we're talking about socioeconomic development. So I don't think, for example, in Latin America, the transparency and accountability movement has lost any track. It's even more important than ever, but the economic evidence or the economic push is, is starting to be also in the map, which I think is good.
The narratives are always been there. I think when we're looking at it, we can't say that it started as anti-corruption and they moved to be we can get more money out of it. McKinsey research came in 2012, I think. Yeah, so it's 2 years after. So we're not that far. And I think we also need to change our sell pitch and what we need in order to get some data sometimes. It's not a bad thing. We can also say better public service delivery. It's also a pitch that we do for open data a lot, and we're discussing it as well in the book. So there's like, what you can say it's economic development, but it's more of a government focus of how to make better service delivery. So we have all of these.
And another question over here in the room.
Hi, I'm Rafa. You know me well. I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned. You said that there has been threats against the open data movement, and I was wondering if you could say more about these things and what are the critical challenges that are being faced in this community.
Yeah. So I guess there's one is a loss of interest threat. So one is funders, policymakers, others simply moving on, leaving, thinking either job is done, we've finished, or just there's no longer any interest in this. And you see that in two places. One, you see it where they're just moving on completely. The other is where their agenda is being widened. So one of the things you see is people who are hired into cities to run the open data team are now given the wider data analytics brief and running the whole kind of data programs, and then their attention gets shifted onto big data, proprietary data, data sets that no one else can see and use, and openness kind of drops away. So I think there's that threat of attention shifting. I think the other threat is privacy arguments being used to push back on openness of sensitive data. So in the case of, say, beneficial ownership transparency, knowing who ultimately owns and runs companies, because we've seen threats of abuse of data, abuse of our personal data by large firms, those same sorts of arguments are used to say, well, look, we can't open up this data for transparency purposes because you're getting into privacy, and privacy's become a kind of, again, a binary card rather than, as we find in the chapter, something that can be dealt with in a more nuanced way. There's other threats out there, but that's probably the key we see. I think we're tight on time.
Yeah. No, I just want to say that like we see other leaders in civil society creating organization and moving on, we also see politicians created like a lot of policies and moving on. UK and the US is an example for that. So you have these champions moving on, and how do you actually help other countries to become champions and release this data? And like basically, do we need to wait in political cycles, or can we make it something that is normalized? How do we do that? That's also a question.
Unfortunately, we're just running out of time. I'm very sorry to the people who are now joining in the data identity debate on Twitter.
Keep going, keep going.
We'll come join you.
Yes.
Just hunt for it. You'll find it with the right search words. I've given enough clues away. So I want to thank Tim and Mor for their time. I'd ask everyone in the room just give a quick round of applause if you could. And also thank them and all of the authors and all of the contributors for their work on the book. It's a great piece of work. I know myself, as I mentioned to Tim just beforehand, I was talking with a journalist at a large international newspaper last week and explaining the concepts of indigenous peoples and data sovereignty, and I could just say, here you go, read this thing. It's easier for me to find that thing. I can just send a link now. More things like that make all of our lives easier and more useful and move things forward. So thank you very much. If you want to continue the conversation, obviously, as we said, at State of Open Data is the
Hashtag.
Is the hashtag Twitter account, which isn't on screen. That's the URL up here is where to get to the book. It's open access. And hopefully we'll see some of you at the ODI Fridays lecture next week. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you.